On behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I'm pleased to introduce Siva Vaidhyanathan, here to discuss the Googlization of everything and why we should worry. Many of us use Google.com and other Google products every day. Our email, our calendars, even our phones have been Googleized. In his new book, Professor Vaidhyanathan urges us to take a closer look at this company whose stated mission is to organize the world's information and make it universally accessible. In its review of the Googlization of everything, Kirkus Reviews states that Vaidhyanathan unmasks the monster beneath the friendly interface with the suspense of a horror novel, and calls it an urgent reminder to look more closely at dangers that lurk in plain sight. Professor Vaidhyanathan is a cultural historian and media scholar, and the author of several previous books on technology and culture, including Copyrights and Copywrongs and The Anarchist in the Library. He's an associate professor of media studies and law at the University of Virginia and a fellow at both the New York Institute for the Humanities and the Institute for the Future of the Book. We're very pleased to bring him to Harvard Bookstore this afternoon. Please join me in welcoming Professor Siva Vaidhyanathan.
Well, it's a pleasure and an honor to be here, and thank you for braving the rain and joining me today. So Google is 12 years old. Its voice hasn't even changed yet, right? It's barely an adolescent, and yet it's been an important part of so many daily activities for so many of us. One of the major reasons I wrote this book is it struck me as weird, historically weird, technically weird, sociologically weird, that one company would serve as the lens through which we view the world in so many ways, so many times a day. I'm not sure, at least I wasn't sure at the beginning, that we should complain about this situation. After all, we invited it, we celebrate it, we relish it, and we do it, right? We Google all the time. And so I tried to enter this project with that sense of weirdness first and foremost. I wanted to constantly remind myself and remind my readers that this was not the natural state of things, right? Things could have gone very differently. So go back to when Google was a newborn. You probably had not even heard of it in its first year, 1998. When it first rolled out for public use, it was actually hosted by the Stanford University servers. You found it at google.stanford.edu. The first few notices that I was able to find in the popular press refer to it at that URL. And even early on, it was clear that Google was going to be the darling of people who were excited about technology, technologically sophisticated. It accomplished a couple of things that had been eluding a lot of other companies that had been trying to organize the web and help navigate the web. First and foremost, it had a blank page, right, with just a box through which you would enter text and generate a fairly clean selection of links. And the links would be in order, and the order seemed to make sense to us, right? It struck us as intuitively right, intuitively relevant. And the great leap that Google made early on was, first of all, to use that blank page. And at a time when, if you remember the web in the late 90s, and some of you might, the web was crazy. It was full of all kinds of flashing things and crazy things, and every page looked like, you know, walking down Times Square in the middle of the night. It was just lots of attention-grabbing devices on too many web pages. In addition, the major search engine services of the day, Alta Vista, for instance, or Yahoo even, which is still with us and actually not going anywhere for a while, those services tended to crowd their pages with content. Some of that content they would actually pay to create. Others they would pay to harvest from other places. There was no sense that these other portals to the web understood the web the way that Google did, right? But the folks who started Google understood, first of all, that you and I are perfectly willing to create content that Google can then harvest and link to and share with us, and they don't have to pay us, right? That's an amazing insight. The other insight about that blank page was the blank page was trustworthy. The blank page said, I'm not trying to sell you anything, and I'm not trying to take you anywhere you don't want to go. And at a time when it was clear that many search engines were actually auctioning off the positions of their search results, Google made it very clear, largely through word of mouth, and thus through the press ultimately, that its search engine results were generated by their algorithms purely. And their algorithms were at a distance from the immediate interests of the company. In fact, the company had no interests, if you can imagine. Until about 2003, the company wasn't even selling advertising, right? It was just running on venture capital money, and it hadn't even figured out a model for selling advertising well until about 2003. So for the first 4 or 5 years of Google's existence, it was there to be great. And it worked. So in 1998, it debuts, right? By the time Google is 1 year old, it's just starting to walk. It was already organizing the web for us. It was already making it clear to millions of web users that the web didn't have to be a chaotic place, that one could use it to draw a usable map for information, to get from one place to another. Well, before search engines were good, before Google really reinvented the search engine, one had to find a good starting page and follow a series of good links to other pages, right? And collect that trail and sometimes try to guide other people through that trail to replicate the same information. And it was maddening and it was chaotic. And you didn't know if you were missing some good stuff. But most of the time, you didn't even find good stuff. You found a lot of scary stuff or weird stuff or inappropriate stuff. And there just was no method to the madness of the web. So Google almost immediately sets itself up, almost inadvertently, as the custodian of the web. Now, over time, Google did something else very clever. Google had to figure out what puts one link above another. Why should one page be more important than another? And the term that Google uses for the criterion upon which it would rank these links is relevance. Which page is more relevant to the search than another page? So there are a lot of different ways to do this, right? In the early days of web search, the number of times a search term showed up on a page counted for a lot, right? Because a page, if there were a page about the Boston Red Sox, it might say Red Sox a lot on that page, and that's a pretty good guess, you would think, for the importance of that page to that search. Problem is, it didn't take long before people figured that out, and they would make a page about something completely different and just load it up with invisible text for common search terms, right? Terms that people were using all the time anyway, and that would trick people into going to these unrelated pages. You can imagine that pornographers were masters at this very early. And the fact that pornographers, people who put up pornography pages in the early days of the web, were generally so much smarter than anybody doing anything else on the web, largely because it was the only kind of business making money on the web at the time. The big trick for Google, as it became the custodian of the web, was to figure out how to make the web less offensive, less threatening, more usable, more pleasant. And if it can do that, Google figured, eventually, right? I'm using Google as if Google is an actual person or animal, right? Which actually my 5-year-old daughter sort of says sometimes. She thinks Google's a person. When she talks about my book, she imagines that I've actually met this person named Google, and I go to California to meet this person named Google, and apparently Google invited me to a party one time. I don't know. There's some story she tells her friends. But imagine this, right? You've got the web, which in the late 90s and early part of the aughts was a scary place, and many reasonable people were not sure how much interaction they wanted to have with the web. These were days when it was hard to convince someone that doing something like banking was a good idea on the web. And that's probably the end of the list, right? Shopping was risky. Research was risky. Putting your kids down in front of the computer without someone looking over his or her shoulder was risky, right? That sort of activity, it was important for everyone who wanted to make money on the web to make the web a less frightening place. And we didn't even notice this was going on. But so Google installed some more criteria. Instead of using this sort of number of times search terms appear in the page, Google decided that there's a vote of affirmation out there, and it's called the hyperlink. If there are people creating web pages around the world, and they happen to be interested in the Boston Red Sox, and they start creating web links to what they consider an authoritative page about information concerning the Boston Red Sox, it may actually be the team's official page. It may be some fan page where a person has tremendous insight. It may be ESPN's page. But they're going to start creating links saying, you want to find out what's going on with the Red Sox? These are the pages to look toward. they don't spell out those words, but by creating hyperlink, it was interpreted as a vote of affirmation. And so the great insight of Google's engineers, and in fact, Google's founders figured this out and wrote a paper when they were in graduate school that basically made it so that a page's relevance would be scored by the number of votes it gets from around the internet. And then they weighted that because they knew that if, for instance, ESPN starts pointing to somebody's homemade page about the Red Sox, that's a really powerful vote of affirmation, right? Or if in some other area, if the Wall Street Journal webpage links to somebody's financial advice blog, there weren't actually blogs at the time, but you can imagine that counts for a lot. That's a major sense of affirmation within that field. And so those votes are weighted more than if I put up a link to somebody's page on my blog, for instance, right? So that was major insight number one. Major insight number two was that you can start scoring the results based on the quality of the page. And this happens a little bit later in Google's history. It actually happens in the last couple of years. Google starts saying there are certain design elements of a page that work better for us and we think work better for our users, our readers. And those are often expressed graphically and not just textually, right? So it's not hard to imagine that pages that are trying to trick you into falling into the pornography world are going to be full of lots of extra video, links that go into strange places, lots of extraneous code, what they call malware, little programs that embed themselves in your browser and ultimately in your operating system and potentially corrupt your computer. Like the bad people in the world are going to load up their pages with lots of nasty stuff. And Google has an interest, again, in making the web usable, trustworthy, and pleasant. And so Google starts downgrading the scores of pages that are designed in such a way and upgrading the score of pages that are designed cleanly, that have keywords in them that relate honestly to the subject of the page, and of course have these votes of affirmation. And so within a very short period of time, the web becomes a trustworthy place. And lo and behold, this in combination with the widespread use of encryption, for instance, you get people actually shopping and actually banking on the web. And the more time people spend on the open web, ultimately the better it is for Google, because Google's the starting place. Instead of having to follow links, you go back to this central place, and it gives you a menu of places to dive into. So you're no longer actually using it in a webby way. You're plumbing for depth when you do a subject search on Google. So that's the nice story. But again, Google's 12 years old. It's an adolescent. Its voice is just starting to change. By 2004, when Google was merely 6, it started remarkably expanding its areas of interest. And about that time, I started really taking notice. I had used Google from 99, from the time I first heard from some very tech-savvy friends that this was the search engine to trust. But around 2004, Google started launching a number of other projects, and we're all familiar with what those projects became. Projects like Google News, projects like Gmail, and the Google Books project, through which it would scan in millions of books from dozens of libraries around the world. Ultimately, it started with 5, including this universities, and then moved on to many others. And this project kind of blew my mind, right? So in 2004, I start reading about this project to scan in millions of books, and I start seeing this amazing hyperbole coming from people who are working for universities and university libraries, from people who are big fans of Google, and from people who just want knowledge to spread. And they start saying, what an amazing thing that this big, powerful company is going to spread knowledge to every corner of the world pretty much for free. And I start reading things from in all sorts of corners, basically saying this is going to unleash information in a remarkable way, create a new Library of Alexandria that anyone can go into. And I'm sitting back there saying, Google's 6 years old, right? I mean, Google at that point was around for less time than Brad Pitt and Jennifer Aniston had been married, right? And look how well that turned out. So I said, why is a university like the University of Michigan or Harvard University or Stanford University asking a 6-year-old company to be the custodian of this immense amount of wealth and knowledge? This can't end well, is basically what I thought. It might start beautifully, but it can't end well, right? This was obviously a controversial project when it came to copyright, right? The publishers and authors whose work was being scanned in without permission raised all sorts of issues and eventually lawsuits, and the lawsuits were settled in a way that made it very clear several years down the line that Google never really intended to make a library. It intended to make a bookstore. And I love bookstores. I'm in a bookstore. Bookstores are great. There's nothing wrong with the bookstore, but I'm not too pleased with the bookstore that tries to pretend it's a library. So from about 2004, I started seeing that Google's real corporate mission statement, which is, believe it or not, to organize the world's information and make it universally accessible, is actually kind of scary. You know, I was born in the 20th century. I lived for about, 40% of the 20th century, and I know enough about the 20th century to know that when somebody makes a big grand statement like that, you need to step back and beware, right? Because 20th century involved a lot of big grand statements that didn't turn out so well either. Not that anything close to chaos and nastiness and horrible tragedy was likely to come from anything Google was doing, but nonetheless, I thought, what an odd thing. What a strange way to run a company, to say that the goal of the company is to organize the world's information and make it universally accessible. Now, I knew enough about the web, right? My job is actually just kind of study the web, right? So I knew enough about the web to know that they're organizing the web. They're not organizing the world's information, and the web is not the world. It wasn't then, it isn't now, right? Because what's valuable or important or relevant on the web is a refraction of what's real in the world. And you can do this by doing a basic Google search for a subject you know a lot about. You will see pages that you might not think of as the most authoritative, but they are the most relevant and according to the standards Google brings to the table, the best design pages with the most links to them. But the web is merely an abstraction of the sort of thought that many people on this earth actually engage in every day. But think of the number of people who don't engage with the web yet. Think of the ways we engage with each other and with information that doesn't actually get accurately reflected on the web. It's really important to remember that Google itself has value judgments and biases built into its algorithms that distill their results in a particular way. And there's nothing wrong with that. It actually is so much better than the absence of that. It's so much better than what anybody else has thought of. But it's not the world, and it's not the world's information. And I'm enough of a pragmatist and enough of a pluralist to think no one institution and no one company should actually have that job of organizing the world's information and making it universally accessible. The mission statement of Harvard University isn't that audacious, right? If you can imagine Harvard not being audacious, right? In that case, I mean, I'm sure the mission of Harvard University actually reads something like to educate the young men of New England to be clergy or something, because that's what it originally was meant to do. But really, that's a stunning mission statement. Now, we're probably all more familiar with its informal motto, the company's informal motto, which is "Don't be evil." And I started thinking what that means, because every time Google does something that causes friction in the world, it sends its cars through the streets of Europe, taking pictures of people without their permission. And in Europe, people are pretty sensitive about anybody taking their picture without permission and putting it in a searchable database. They've had some bad experiences with databases. They didn't call them databases in the 30s and 40s, but they had some bad experiences with people keeping too much information about people in centralized place and then using it to pull people out of their neighborhoods and houses and sending them off on trains. So, there's a little bit of sensitivity in Europe about privacy and about personal information that we don't necessarily have that kind of level of concern here in this country. We're a lot more trustworthy, if of nothing else, the private sector and major corporations, right? But there's been a lot of conflict in Europe, a lot of tension in Europe, a lot of stress and friction over these sorts of things. In the United States, of course, we've had a lot of friction and controversy about YouTube, about things that show up on YouTube, and a lot of friction and controversy about the Google Book program, right? And understanding that every time that Google is confronted with a situation in which somebody is upset and somebody calls for some sort of intervention or regulation, Google's basic defense is, trust us, we treat you well, we've always treated you well, we have this internal ethic, this internal motto of "Don't be evil." They actually don't say those words out loud. Like the CEO of Google, Eric Schmidt, who's about to step down, to my knowledge, has never stood up in front of an audience and said, we believe we believe the motto "Don't be evil." I've never heard him say that, but it's embedded in many things he does say, and many other major officials at Google say things that sound like a declaration of corporate social responsibility. So I started asking that question. Why do we fall for that every time, first of all? Secondly, why do we think that a company that is basically 12 years old is going to be anything like it currently is in the next 20 years? Why would we think that future performance is in any way predicted by past performance, because it isn't. Of course, conditions change, right? Companies change, economies change, politics change. And we do know that in the world of new media or the world of digital communication or the markets dealing with the internet, that nobody's king for very long, right? Because when Google started, everyone was concerned that Microsoft would be calling all the shots in our information ecosystem. I bought that. I thought that was true, right? Things shifted over time. Now Google is the one we worry about. Now we're starting to worry about Facebook. And in fact, Google's worried about Facebook for some very legitimate reasons in terms of competition and for advertising dollars and our attention. And so as I started stringing together these concerns, I thought it's really important that I come up with a way to sort of distill what Google means to us and what we mean to Google. Other really great writers had gotten inside of Google, had traveled on the plane with the big guys who run Google, had told the story of the company, had written the biography of the company. And other people had written lots of books about how we can all learn from Google or other companies can learn from Google and make a lot of money. I couldn't write books like that, and other good writers had already done that, right? My contribution, I hoped, as I started this book, was to delve into our relationship with Google. What does Google mean to us, and what do we mean to Google? What is the nature of the transaction? Why does Google do all this for me, right? Why do they spend so many billions of dollars on services that help me make my life better, and they don't ask for any money from me? What's going on there? I mean, we should be a little suspicious of that. So what is the nature of the transaction? What am I giving Google? The obvious answer, once you think about it for 5 minutes, is I'm not actually Google's customer, and neither are you, right? I'm Comcast's customer, so I get mad at Comcast all the time, right? Something doesn't work or my bill's too high, I get mad at Comcast because I'm writing a check to it. I know I'm Comcast's customer. But I'm not Google's customer. I'm Google's product. I am what Google sells to advertisers. That's nothing new, right? I'm NBC's product every Sunday when I watch when I watch the NFL, right? NBC's selling my attention to beer companies and car companies. So it's not a new model, but I think we forget it because of the depth of interaction and immersion in Google. We consider Google to be a part of our lives, embedded in our lives. Google keeps very good track of our intentions and our desires and our fetishes and obsessions, and focuses the results of our searches to reflect what we have already told Google we really, really like thinking about. Now that has some interesting implications. And Google is changing, right? So I described earlier the ways that Google mastered the web, figured out a great, efficient, and effective way to help us navigate the web, right? Some brilliant ideas about counting these links, weighting these links properly. So in recent years, in the last 2 years, Google's added yet another layer of standards or criteria. And what they're really focusing on now is what they call the user experience. They want our experience with Google to be really satisfying, deeply satisfying, and more fun than it has been before. More satisfying in a social way, more satisfying in an intellectual way, more satisfying, and this is most important, in a commercial way. So they are taking the record of our expressions and desires that we enter in the little box, right? It's the confessional. We confess to Google, right? What we really wanted, what we really did, or what we shouldn't have done and we're thinking about and we probably shouldn't be thinking about. We put all that in the Google box. We get results. Google makes a note. It doesn't necessarily associate that text you put into the box with you as a person. It doesn't care about your name. It doesn't care about your social security number. But it cares about where you're sitting when you're doing that. So it knows generally in the world where you are, and it can associate your set of inquiries with others who sit in the same general area. It might also, over time, if you happen to have an account with Google, like a Gmail account, build up a pretty rich set of indicators of the sorts of cars you like, the sorts of shoes you like, the sorts of books you like. Kind of like how Facebook does it, just because we tell Facebook all this stuff, right? Foolishly, hey, Facebook, I like this music. And of course, Facebook's job is to take all that data and associate ads in the column to try to sell us stuff. Well, Google's trying to do the same sort of thing with the record of intentions that we give Google. And again, it's not anything that's easily exploitable, as far as we know. It's not easily attachable to our name and social security number and address, as far as we know. It does know our location in many cases, especially if you have a Google phone, an Android phone. Google knows where you are almost all the time, right? There's a GPS chip in there. Or Apple knows where you are if you have an iPhone. So with all of this data, Google is increasingly focusing the results on you, customizing the results, and localizing the results. So you're not likely to come up with a result that is distant from you, or is sort of out of character, or out of place, or out of the field through which you usually explore. That has some pretty amazing implications. First of all, that's really great. Think of the time they're saving us, right? I think a lot about a particular sports team, or I think a lot about a particular kind of car. Maybe I have a car that breaks down a lot, and I do a lot of searches for parts and repairs. Well, Google's going to help me save time, so I'm not clicking too much. It's going to keep giving me results that reflect those sorts of areas, right? Because Google eventually will understand I do a lot of searches for that brand of car. That's really great for shopping, for buying. It's not so great for learning. If we want an information ecosystem that actually serves us well as curious people, as citizens, as people who are trying to navigate the world and make sense of the world, as people who are trying to figure out what these symptoms mean, as people who are trying to figure out what's going on with climate change, as people who are trying to figure out what's going on with healthcare reform, we might actually be better off not having focused information. We might be better off coming across a set of results that surprise us or challenge us, a set of results that don't reinforce where we already were and where we already are. We might be better off coming up with a set of results that aren't particularly geared toward consumption. And we're better off coming up with a set of results that aren't a mixture of ways to help us consume and ways to help us learn. Now, for a dozen years, we've gotten very lucky. Google has served both of these interests remarkably well. Think of all the times Google has helped you answer a really important question. And of course, if you're in any way doubtful or critical of Google, you probably went to a second source. You might have called a librarian. You might have called someone who's written a book on the subject. You might have called a doctor instead of just going to WebMD through Google, right? You might have clicked on the second page of results. You might have run the same search on another search engine. All of these are very healthy techniques. And another reason I wrote this book is I wanted people to learn how to use Google in a better way. I use Google every day, dozens of times a day. I used Google to find my way to this store, right? I'm not in any way going to advocate that we not use Google. But I am going to advocate that we use Google in a wiser way. Not just a smarter way, a wiser way. I want us to all understand that Google has biases and limitations baked into its algorithms. That Google is a company, it's a publicly traded company that must satisfy the desires of its shareholders to enhance value. That is its job number one. And it's been so good at that, it's been so wealthy that it can afford to be good. And so it has, for the most part. And even when it's bad, it thinks it's being good, which is part of the problem. But with all that, we could be better, right? The real problem is with us. The real problem is we are so addicted to the speed and convenience of that lovely set of results that comes in a nice set of 10 with a value attached to each. And we trust it. We trust it so much that almost nobody clicks past result number 3 on the first page of results, let alone click to the second page. That's absurd. Right? Nobody clicks to the second page. And in fact, next time you do a Google search, please click to the second page just to see what's there. You never know, right? But we've seen study after study, academic studies and industry studies show that people do not even question the judgment that Google makes. People do not question the judgment to the point of clicking on results 4, 5, or 6. It's 1, 2, or 3. And actually, if a lot of people start clicking on 2, it soon becomes number 1. So with all that, I think it's incumbent upon us to mix it up a little bit, right? To bring a little bit of diversity into our information ecosystem. To make sure that while we want Google to keep getting better and keep serving us so well, you know, in a way that all we're really giving it is this list of our desires. And that's not that bad a price to pay considering the value it's brought to our lives. But let's do it in a more intelligent way, in a wiser way. Let's understand what the real risks and costs are. Let's understand that we actually have the power to manipulate what Google learns about us and how it follows us. And you can actually do that. It takes about 7 clicks. Most people don't want to make those 7 clicks, right? We don't even want to do it on Facebook when it's clear we should be doing it. But on Google, you really can customize what information you give Google to a large degree. There's a cost to that, and that's another important thing we need to learn about Google. If you customize the way Google tracks you and if you limit the amount of information and the kinds of information Google follows about you, you degrade the service that Google gives you. And it's a real obvious trade-off once you start clicking on those things. You start seeing that Google no longer helps you shop as well, but it might actually help you learn a little better and challenge you a little bit. So as Google becomes better for shopping and worse for learning, that raises, I think, a really important question for us as citizens of the country and citizens of the world. Because I happen to think there's more to life than shopping, although not today. Please shop, right? This is important. Shop here and shop a lot. But yeah, after you get out of here, maybe you don't have to shop quite so much. But when you think about the extent to which we depend on this medium of the World Wide Web to learn about the world, maybe we need to imagine different systems. Maybe we need to invest more in systems like public libraries and university libraries and their outreaches to other communities. Maybe we have to imagine that we can build a system, and it might take 50 years, build a system that can equalize the maldistribution of information across the world to the point where, and I don't think this is impossible, that a child growing up in South Africa has no disadvantage compared to a child growing up in Sweden when it comes to access to information. We have the tools to make that happen right now. We might have the political will to make it happen right now. We haven't even tested it. And the reason we haven't tested it is that Google's been too good to us, right? We've been going on believing that cotton candy is real food. And Google keeps feeding us great services that simulate this equality of information, this democratization of information. And Google, of course, is sincere that it would like the number of web users in the world to increase exponentially. Google would love, as much as I would love, for every 12-year-old growing up in South Africa to have access to amazing information. And it's pouring money into such projects, and that's beautiful. But we should not rely on this 12-year-old company to guide that effort. Because over time, there are going to be hard choices to make in terms of policy, hard choices to make in terms of technology, hard choices to make in terms of practice. And so as a citizen, I think it's imperative that we start asking questions about whether we want Google to handle all of our shopping and all of our learning needs. And if we don't, and if we recognize that Google in 20 years is almost certain to be a very different company, maybe even owned at that time by somebody completely different, like the reincarnated head of Rupert Murdoch or something, right? Who knows what's going to happen down the line? But at that point, Google won't be the Google that we grew up with, right? The mature Google is going to have different pressures, it's going to have different. Who's going to know what the World Wide Web is in 20 years? We didn't know what it was 20 years ago, right? And as we move more of our information-seeking habits and shopping-seeking habits to lock down closed devices that aren't really on the web but are connected through digital networks nonetheless, and the more time we spend in the gated community of Facebook as opposed to the open web, the less money Google's going to make in the long term unless it can keep expanding its market. So this is an interesting battle going on that we should be paying a lot of attention to. Right? Google wants people to be comfortable with the web, as I said at the beginning, and is doing everything it can to keep the internet open and free because that's good for Google. Not just because it's good for us. It happens to be good for us, which is nice. But over time, not everything that's good for Google will be good for us. And we have to be prepared for that divergence. And at those moments, we're going to have to ask, are there things that we want to preserve and extend and build that Google should not do for us or could not do for us? And under those conditions, we might want to decide to take some other route. Crazy as it may seem, the route we might want to take is the old-fashioned public library. We might want to invest more in its presence, in its power, in its expansion, because that is a reasonable, citizen-driven, good old-fashioned Republican with a small r institution. And it's there to help us as citizens. And it's there to help us as information seekers, as learners, as students, as teachers. And we take it for granted because it works so well. And we make this sort of false conclusion that Google sends information to us so efficiently that we need the public library less. But in fact, Americans these days use the public library more than ever. Americans these days are visiting public libraries in record numbers. The Americans who happen to be visiting libraries in record numbers don't subscribe to broadband access at home. In fact, they can't actually write the check to Comcast for broadband access at home. And that's what we have to remember, because our goal as citizens should be for maximum empowerment of all citizens. Our goal as consumers should be to get the best price as consumers. And again, that's such a different way of being in the world. And I think it's time we start taking both roles seriously instead of just one. Thank you very much, and I'd love to have questions for you. Right. So a couple of things to a couple of things to remember about this very case. Now, everything we do in the electronic environment is traceable by somebody, and Google may actually be low on the list of potential problems here. And I say that because, first of all, Google has done what it could do under our laws to keep federal investigators away from phishing expeditions in their data. Unfortunately for us and for Google, our laws are on the side of the government, right? So that's a problem with our government and not for Google. And I think this is a really important part of this, right? We've become so dependent on companies behaving well, right? We've become so dependent on us demanding that the companies we use in our lives treat us well and are responsible, that we forget that sometimes it's not up to them. The fact is, our leaders wrote some really bad laws that not only give investigators way too much power that has no real oversight and accountability embedded in it, and that didn't happen too long ago, and it doesn't seem to be changing for the better in recent months either. But on top of that, Google is not the only private company in the chain, right? Comcast and AT&T and Verizon and Time Warner are all part of the surveillance system, and they keep rich data on what we do as well. In fact, if you work for a university, the university keeps logs of much of what you do as well. And sometimes they purge the logs and sometimes they don't, and sometimes they anonymize the logs and sometimes they don't. But right now, the government's on a big effort to get internet service providers to cease purging and anonymizing the logs. They want to have a record of who logged on where from when and did what, because they want to use it for investigation and for data mining, right? And so those companies actually don't want to be a part of that. They don't want the responsibility. They don't want the expense to be the custodian of that kind of information. So it's not like they're really defending our interests or defending their own interests. It just so happens in this case, most of those companies actually do want to protect us if they can. They'd rather be on our side than the government side, but not out of love. It's actually out of concern for just having too much of a hassle and an expensive hassle. Nonetheless, we're losing and those companies are losing, right? So you're absolutely right to be concerned about the fact that any of us could get snagged in some sort of phishing expedition for data. It's too easy to come up with what are called false positives in these sort of data analysis games. And we've already seen the case of a number of innocent people dragged into bad situations, took years to extricate themselves from because they happen to have the wrong data points in a system. That's a much bigger problem. I'm not ready to write that book. I'm angry enough to write that book, but I'm not qualified enough to write that book. Now, I'm not anti-Google, but what I'm against is our own faith-based embrace of Google in all things. And that's why I think there will be times, and privacy is one of these areas, there are times when we might want to, in fact, I do want to, invoke the power of the state to restrict the amount of information that these companies can hold about us and the manner in which they hold it about us. I think that's really important, and it's becoming more important every day. Now, that's an argument we need to have, and it has to occur at a better level than trust us, we're Google, we've never done you wrong, right? That's really where I'm coming down. Like, I just think we need to be more responsible citizens, more engaged citizens, and more engaged users. And we do want to use the power that people have, which at times actually involves the state, to take care of our interests. You got a question in the back? Oh, yeah, Google Scholar. Okay, so Google Scholar started around the same time, right? 2005, 2006. And Google Scholar was a neat idea that came out of this policy that Google has inside, where they let employees spend 1 day a week, 20% of their time, working on projects that don't serve the bottom line of Google, that are not about their prime project. And a couple of folks at Google decided there's all this scholarly literature that's really helpful and might be really valuable to people outside of the scholarly environment, right? I get access to this amazing collection of information through scholarly journals by virtue of working for a university. But if you don't work for a university and you don't go to a university, you're out of luck because you don't even know it's there. A standard web search doesn't bring this up. So they invented Google Scholar And they got permission from all these scholarly publishers to come through and let Google index their information to present these access to these articles. Now, of course, if you've used it, you know that if you're not in a university environment, you generally have to pay ultimately for the article that you find, but at least you can find the article. So that's all great, and I think that's a super thing up to a point. The problem again is how they do it, right? How they do the search system, for one thing, because there are biases built into that search engine. One thing about scholarly articles is they don't link to each other, right? If I write a scholarly article, as I have, and my friend Jonathan here, who's another professor, writes a scholarly article, they're not, even if they're about the same subject, even if we cite each other in the footnotes, there's no electronic link, right? There's no hyperlink like on the web. And that hyperlink is the magic thing that Google follows. So what is it that makes Google rank one result over another in Google Scholar? Nobody really knows, and I've used it enough to know that it's not dependable. You lose a lot of stuff, you miss a lot of stuff, and again, just like with web search, if you do the same search a week later, you get different results, right? The instability of it is maddening as someone who needs to pay attention to where articles are. If you do an exact title search or author search in Google Scholar, you generally find what you want, but if you're just grazing around in a subject area, it's maddening. It's maddening. I mean, again, better than nothing, poorly designed. And because it doesn't make Google any money, they're not likely to make it better. They don't need to. It's good enough. So I tell my students, especially graduate students, starting with Google Scholar is fine, but do not stop there. There are going to be a lot of articles that Google Scholar does not show you, and the only way to do that is to walk through the professionally built indexes available through the library. But again, you have to be affiliated with the university to get that level of access, and that's a shame. I think that should be on the agenda of what I call the Human Knowledge Project, this 50-year plan to give everyone in the world decent access to decent information. It is, but it's not even a subpoena. A subpoena would be great because a judge issues a subpoena. What happens right now is that the FBI can use national security letters to wrench out information on just about anything. And that requires no oversight at all. That's just an FBI agent saying, I want to do this. And it has not only the power to compel someone, like a bookstore, for instance, to hand over records of what people have purchased, but it also has deniability built in so that the subject of that security letter is not allowed to, I'm sorry, that the firm that's handed that security letter is not allowed to tell the subject of the investigation of its existence. So you don't get to defend yourself if you're being investigated. Okay, now is this part of the Patriot Act? Yes and no. Part of it is part of the Patriot Act. Those national security letters are, but there are other things, other elements of their investigative power that come from earlier laws from the Clinton years, and basically what we have now is a system in which if you're a really bad person doing really bad things, you don't have to worry about any of this powerful investigative power because you're going to use strong encryption. And you're going to use strong encryption in a really smart way because it actually doesn't take that much investment. So the really bad people in the world are totally escaping from this surveillance state. It's just the dumb people, right? The people who, and you've read about them, they got arrested for being really dumb and coming up with plans that were never going to work, right? Because they were too dumb to know to use encryption, and they met in public places, and they used email to forge their plans, and they get busted, and then the FBI has a big press conference, and everybody cheers. But we have a really absurd situation where bad people who want to do really bad things are basically outside of the power of the law. And so the FBI, which has to show that it's doing something, ends up snagging people who perhaps aren't that dangerous.
Well, I was thinking more of the... Even a relevant issue.
I think you're absolutely right. And in internet company years, it's actually quite old, right? It's actually quite established. But that speaks to my point, I think, in a stronger way than my cute way of expressing it earlier, right? And by that I mean that because internet time is so compressed, 12 years is a time that demonstrates its power and success, right? It speaks well to its ability to thrive, and you could actually look at its balance sheets and its returns and its quarterly reports to see that as well. That said, we know that the environment shifts so quickly, and the nature of companies shifts so quickly, and internet company years are so compressed that for that reason, we can't expect it at 20 to resemble what it is at 12, or perhaps even to expect it to be around at 20, right? I mean, General Motors has been around for about 75 years, and that's pretty impressive, but it's not what it was, and it almost wasn't a year ago, right? So so that's a long company, but that's in an industry that's heavy, that builds things that last, an industry that basically bought off the government and made sure it had tremendous subsidies to make it happen at every point, not just lately, but that's a different game. So that industry has a different time compression factor than internet industries. So while you're right, I mean, I wanted to really compare it to the older institutions with deep roots that are ultimately, I think, the proper custodians of our information ecosystem, libraries and universities. And not limited to libraries and universities, but the sense of our collective culture, right? This notion that I think we should have a diversity of interests, and we should respect the gathered wisdom of these institutions and the people who work there, and not just be dazzled by the new. That was really my point. Yeah, the biggest danger is it's cheap or free, and universities right now are under such pressure to do whatever they can for almost nothing. So most universities I know of are now considering, if they haven't already, shifted their email hosting to Google, letting Google host their emails. And that, at least with students, if not for staff and faculty. And what's going on with that is that basically Google gets a customer for life. If a student graduates and the student wants to keep that email consistent, because he or she already has lots of job search information on that email, for instance, that person's going to remain a Google customer through email. So it's a nice trick for them, right? But nothing really sleazy about it. The danger is, of course, that universities are supposed to keep the highest level of privacy respect for their students, and that's compromised once you shift important information to a third party. And I'm not convinced that in that instance, and in instances where professors are being urged to use Google Documents service in classes and as part of courseware, in those cases, I'm not convinced that universities are looking out for the best interests of students in all cases. They're going for the cheap and easy and not necessarily building in proper safeguards through negotiation, because there's almost no reason to negotiate with someone who's giving you something for free. But that's, I think, in the real world, if someone's trying to give you something for free out on the street, you should be wary, right? You should be negotiating. But that's really not how it's working at universities right now.
What's the privacy danger that you saw?
Okay, sure. So any record of a student's grades in any way, like a paper that's been graded or comments about performance or recommendation letters that I happen to write for a student, are not supposed to be distributed beyond the authorized recipient. So if I write a recommendation letter in which I will often say how a student performed in my class, only the recipient of that, with the student's permission, is allowed to read it. And the student has to waive the right to read it him or herself, actually, legally, according to federal law. And any grade report can only be shared with the student. I can't even tell parents what the grades are, which drives parents crazy, right? So that's the sort of, but then that's really important, because you never really know who you're dealing with on the other side of the phone. So respecting that sort of relationship and treating students as adults is a really important part of the culture of our institutions and an important part of federal law. And I'm afraid we're letting that slip in a lot of different ways. When we invite Facebook into the classroom, when we invite YouTube into the classroom, as we're encouraged to do increasingly, we run a lot of risks, and I don't think we've thought it all through. Yeah, well, you can go to the privacy settings and come up with a comfortable level of privacy settings. But as I say, when you do that, you do limit the functionality of a lot of its services. But the other thing is, just know, if you're aware that everything you type into Google's search box is used in some way, either by associating it with you in some way or collectively as part of your community, then you might actually be a little bit careful about how you construct a search. You might want to turn off the ability for Google to follow you for certain searches and turn it back on when you're doing innocent searches or searches that might not be misconstrued. There are deft and clever ways to use Google, using the tools that Google gives us. The problem is the defaults are set, and the defaults are always set for maximum vacuuming of the information, right? So Google wants you to be already comfortable and unsuspicious, and therefore willing to give it everything to be used in every way and shared as widely as possible. The default is always maximum. It's up to us, unfortunately, to train ourselves, to be wary, to be careful, to worry, and then take action. I think this is the wrong way to have a system. And I wish that our laws actually made it so the companies had to convince us to turn on the spigot, right? So the companies had to say, by the way, if you let us collect the following information, we will give you a better service, and this is exactly what it will be. That's an honest transaction. But to have the default on maximum and have us have to guess what we should set it to, that's actually not very honest. And so for a company that proclaims to be responsible, I think fundamentally its deal with us is dishonest. Yeah, so Google has so many competitors in so many areas. I mean, think about the fact that Google now is a mobile phone company, and so Nokia is a competitor, right? And so is Apple, and so is BlackBerry, right? So that's one market in which it has intense competition. In the area of publishing, now Google is involved. I said it's built a bookstore, right? But it's also trying to offer sales and access to electronic versions of periodicals through the same system, and those deals that they negotiate with vendors and with publishers are real thorny. Now, I'm actually a huge fan of what Google's doing in the publishing area. I'm not a big fan of what they're doing with the library content, but I'm not actually that upset about Google. I'm upset that the university libraries are suckers and went for this major corporate welfare deal without getting enough out of it and not protecting our interests. If Google wants to do this and create cool things and make money from it, I have no problem with it. But what Google's doing in publishing, both in periodicals and with books, is really undermining the powerful position that Amazon's been in for a number of years, right? Amazon is the problem in the publishing industry. And believe me, if I thought I could sell even one book, I'd write a book about Amazon. But Amazon would make sure I would never sell the book. No, I'm kidding. Who knows if that would... actually, I'm sure Amazon doesn't care what the books inside say, right? Or what's inside the book. Amazon just wants to sell items. They sell widgets, and that's actually part of the problem. They're really good and efficient about selling widgets at a cheap price. And by driving down the price and considering every book to be a commodity rather than a discrete cultural item, they do great harm to people who write books for a living and people who sell books for a living and people who publish books for a living. At the same time, for people who read, it's a great deal, right? So that's the massive trade-off. It just so happens that we have huge government subsidies for Amazon, because if you buy my book in this store, you have to pay sales tax. And if you buy my book on Amazon, you don't have to pay sales tax. Oh, I didn't say that. But we subsidize Amazon. We have government policies that make Amazon richer and challenge stores like this. And that's a shame, and that shouldn't happen. But it is the case. Amazon has had a heavy hand in all its negotiations with publishers. It's been dictating the terms in terms of the percentage that publishers get, the royalties that authors get in some cases, and it's been trying to force down the price of electronic books to this commodity level of $9.99. And by doing that, it doesn't respect the fact that publishing's not that simple. Every book is not going to yield a return if it's priced at $9.99. And if consumers get used to paying no more than $9.99 and consider every book, whether it's 100 pages or 400 pages, to be worth $9.99, then you're going to have a real tough time selling books that we know can't sell more than 500 or 1,000 copies. I'm talking about scholarly books mostly. That we know might fail, or likely to fail, and only sell a few thousand copies when the publisher thought it would sell 50,000 copies, right? For books like that, it's important to come up with a price point that actually covers the money sunken into the production process. But Amazon wants to disrupt that system and treat all books like a commodity. So what's happened with the competitors like Google, and now with Apple doing its bookstore, and with Barnes & Noble doing its electronic bookstore, and a lot of independent publishers contributing electronic books in new and interesting ways as well, and that often gets lost in the big newspaper coverage of this industry, you have now more players who are able to work with publishers in gentler and more competitive ways. And so publishers now have the ability, although it rarely happens, to say no to Amazon. And that wasn't the case for... before about 7 or 8 months ago or a year ago. To say no to Amazon in terms of book distribution, especially electronic book distribution, was death. But now that there are enough competitors out there, and Google is a big reason why, and I know a lot of people in the publishing world are thrilled that Google's involved in this, because Google's not out to cash in a big way on the sale of books. That's going to be a major side project for Google, but always a side project. And so Google's role in the publishing industry, its role with newspapers, its role with magazines over time, I think will be beneficial, at least that's how it looks today, to all of those industries. And I'm really happy to see them deal in a less coercive way with see Google deal in a less coercive way with publishers, because if it were just Amazon, we'd all be in trouble. Yeah. Well, so in terms of Bing and competition, so in the United States, Google has, for the last couple of years, had about 70% of the search activity. And that number hasn't necessarily changed even as Bing has gone up, because most of the new users Bing is bringing in, it's taking from Yahoo, which is actually a partner in Bing. So in some ways, it's a zero sum there. It is taking some of the searches away from Google a little bit, but Google is also growing. And Google is growing not so much in the US, but it's growing tremendously across the world. So, for instance, in Western Europe, Google is more than 90% of the share of searches in most Western European countries. In places like the Netherlands and Portugal, it's more than 96%. And I actually don't know why. I don't know why Google is more popular in Europe, even though it's held under greater suspicion there. Like, we love Google in this country, but we don't use it as much as the people who fear it over in Europe. That's kind of weird. But that's weird, but that's happening. But there's tremendous growth in Africa. There's tremendous growth in the Arab nations. There's tremendous growth in India, where Google has managed to come up with multiple language search engines for the various 14 to 20 languages in India. It's come out with most of those. I lose count right now of how many of those languages it runs search in. No Indian company had the audacity or the money to sink into that complicated linguistic challenge. Google did it. And so there actually are a number of homegrown search engines in India that have since failed, because Google now not only can take you through a language search in Telugu or Hindi or Marathi, but can take you through a really effective search in the language of commerce in India, which is English. And so the growth in India has been tremendous. The two places that Google has not been able to grow are Russia and the People's Republic of China. And actually, Google's not so strong in Japan or South Korea for different reasons. In South Korea, the government helped invest early on in a search engine that specialized in Korean language search. And every language is a different challenge in search, because syntax is different in every language, right? So doing these relations among words and terms is a complicated thing. And Google does really well in English. Despite having one of its founders born in Russia, it's not that good in Cyrillic, apparently. And within Russia, there is a strong sense of nationalism. So the homegrown search engines in Russia are much more powerful and popular than Google, even though there's very little web censorship in Russia. In China, of course, you have explicit web censorship, a huge thorny relationship between Google and the People's Republic of China, and you have a number of search engines that are sponsored by or at least allowed to thrive by the government. And there are a number of other reasons why other search engines do better in China than Google does, and Google's actually doing worse. Now, that said, in the United States, I think that Google is actually much more concerned about Facebook than it is about Bing. Bing is explicitly about shopping, right? It doesn't even fool you. Nobody goes to Bing to try to research climate change, right? You go to Google to try to research climate change. And that's not always that great, right? But you go to Bing to book an airline ticket, to buy shoes, right? It's, as it says in the commercials, a decision engine. You will never see a commercial for Bing saying, use Bing to find out about dinosaurs. It's just not going to happen, right? They're not interested in grabbing you that way, because it's harder to make money that way, right? It's harder to make money with dinosaur links. But for that reason, Google is adjusting to what Bing's doing in the market by becoming better for shopping. But more importantly, Google wants to keep you happy with the open web so you spend less time in Facebook. That's the real competitor, because the dollars are in the ads. And they're really afraid that Facebook is going to manage to leverage all that information we give Facebook about the things we love and the people we love and turn that into a really efficient advertising machine. So far, Facebook has not mastered it, which is why our Facebook pages are filled with ridiculous ads that are inappropriate to us much of the time. But everyone's pretty concerned and confident that Facebook will crack the code at some point soon.